This morning, the government published a white paper on the railways, which proposed the creation of a body called Great British Railways to manage all sides of the industry. Those with long memories will recall something called British Rail, which in many ways did exactly that. It was abolished in the 1990s by a Conservative government. Speaking in 1992, Transport Secretary John McGregor explained the decision.
We believe that getting the injection of more private sector skills, private sector management, private sector finance, marketing skills closer to the customer, on top of the existing dedication and engineering skills of British Rail, is actually the way to get better services for the passenger.
So, what does this morning's news tell us about the way the party's thinking on the role of the state has changed? David Gauke is a former Conservative Cabinet Minister. Ryan Shorthouse is the director of the centre-right think tank Bright Blue. Good afternoon to you both.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
David Gauke, that little clip there is a reminder that the orthodoxy in the Thatcher years was that the state was rotten at running things, and the best way of bringing sanity to the way things like the railways worked was to hand them over to the private sector.
Yes, I don't think that today's announcement is a complete abandonment of that, because there's still going to be a great deal of outsourcing involved in the new structure. But the challenge, I think, that they're faced with the railways is similar in a number of areas, that the uncertainty that we've seen, particularly over recent months, has been very challenging in a number of circumstances, and the state has had to step in. And these might be exceptional circumstances, but once the sort of state steps in, it's harder for the state to step back. So I think we've seen that happening. And then I also think that, if you like, the coalition of support behind the Conservative Party has changed very rapidly in the last couple of years, and a lot of the support that the Conservative Party now receives are from people who have traditionally, on economic grounds, tended to vote Labour, but on cultural grounds feel much closer to the Conservative Party. And not surprisingly, a Conservative government is responding to that. I think today's announcement is more a practical solution to what's happened with uncertainty over passenger numbers, but I think generally the drift towards the bigger state is also reflecting changed the political landscape of this country.
And Ryan Shorthouse, I suppose, just staying with the railways for a moment before we move on to sort of more general matters, the Labour Party could be forgiven for feeling rather cheesed off, in the sense that bringing the railways back into public ownership, which this obviously isn't quite, but has elements of it, was a signature policy of Jeremy Corbyn's.
Yeah, I mean, I do sense there's a kind of public shift towards a kind of increased acceptance of the role of the state. And you are seeing a Conservative government, for example, in terms of levels of spending, even before COVID, really increasing that to focus on so-called left-behind areas and the levelling up agenda. So, if the Conservative government, the 2010s, was about fiscal discipline and austerity, then the one of 2020s is much looser on fiscal policy and increasing spending. So it's there's the sort of bigger state generally, but also in areas like the railways, but also the health service. The government's planning more ministerial oversight, a little bit more sceptical of kind of private providers in the NHS. You are seeing that drift both in public attitudes and in Conservative Party approaches in various different policy areas to a bigger role for the state. And I think, echoing what David said, I think some of this is down to COVID and the times that we're facing. We had to prop up demand in the economy, have this intervention, huge intervention from the state. But also, I think Brexit changed everything. Cameron talked about detoxifying the Tory brand. Brexit has finally detoxified it in those areas, in old industrial coastal areas, which for a long time were very sceptical of the Tory party, because they associated that party with shutting down a lot of the industry, shipping, steelworks, coal mines. But Brexit finally gave a change in argument there, a change in approach and attitude towards the Conservative Party. So in a way, Cameron enabling the referendum was a kind of accidental way of detoxifying it. And as such, you now have a constituency of voters who are voting for the Tory party, who I suppose, to kind of crudely put it, are more interested in issues around security rather than freedom, and that means prioritising a greater role for the state.
Sorry, just to, David Gort, to underline the scale of that change, a lot of Tory MPs, when you perhaps first became a member of the Commons, were deeply sceptical about the idea that the state could do useful things.
Yes, that's right. I mean, one can overstate it, and sometimes these things can be simplified. But the idea of government running lots of things, there was a lot of scepticism about it, and not just in the Conservative Party as well. You can see elements of that in some of the sort of Blair public service reforms as well. But you are still going to be left with some challenges, as Ryan rightly says, a lot of control coming into the hands of ministers if you look at some of these policies. And to what extent will politics start to, when it comes to decision making, start to trump rigorous appraisal of what's in economic best interests and so on. And I think that's going to be a challenge, because sometimes government can be swayed by public opinion in a way that isn't helpful for achieving objectives.
Very quick final word from you, Ryan Shorthouse. A big problem for Labour.
Well, it is, because I suppose Tories have moved more to the left on economics, so it's hard for Labour to find a way through that. So and the opinion polling is backing that up, as well as the results from the recent elections, that the Labour Party, even with a new leader who's much more centrist, is struggling to cut through and beat the Tories in that new political positioning. That
we must leave it there. Thank you both very much indeed for joining us. PM's at 5. This is Edward Sturton, and that's The World at 1:45.